G'day everybody, nice to see you. So I'm going to talk about the regional governance frameworks. I'm pretty lazy sometimes, so I'm going to try to see if you can answer or explain most of my presentation for me before we really get going. So regional governance frameworks, I know a lot of you work in fisheries, some of you work in labour, HR, training, foreign affairs as well. So all of you and academic institutions as well with USP. So you should have a good handle on regional governance frameworks, but I thought we'd draw it out first and see if you can really give me the key elements of what they are, why we need them, why is it relevant to our discussion on IUU, and then what are those key examples in the Pacific. So can I ask someone what is a regional governance framework? In your own words, you can be fisheries related, it can be non-fisheries. If I don't get a volunteer, I'll have to pick on somebody. There's no wrong answers, just silly questions from Viv. So, a regional governance framework. Jonas, you knew I was going to pick on you. I made eye contact. In your perspective, what is a regional governance framework? What does that mean?
Is a legal instrument that a guideline? For me, it's a guideline that tries to set out rules and procedures along that line. For what? For the let me think for.
Okay, so some really good initial points there. The first thing Jonas said was an instrument, so looking at an agreement, and then something about setting out the rules and the approaches. So a regional governance framework, I'd say in most cases, is probably not guidelines. It's actually something a bit stronger, like an instrument, what you said. So we had some really great examples of the international environment, international governance frameworks. We heard from Francis and Kathleen about the different instruments that are there. But why do we need regional governance frameworks? So in the fisheries context, we've got things that Jonas had said, instruments and things that can outline the rules and processes and things in place, but why do we need them? Please.
So we need a regional governance framework because we're making a decision on migratory species, for example, tuna. All the RFMOs come together to make a decision or negotiate the terms towards managing and conserving these marine resources. It's of an economic value to the different countries, different jurisdictions that are involved in making decisions for the conservation and management of this resource, if it is in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's pretty much if we can just copy and paste that. That's exactly what we've heard, an example of a regional governance framework for RFMOs that are focused on fisheries, on sustainable management of fisheries. We heard a comment about the fact that there's a number of different parties or countries that are involved, so they're multilateral. But a question I'd have, we heard there's a whole bunch of international governance frameworks to regulate IUU fishing. We just heard the slide that we just saw this morning and then yesterday. There's so many, going back from UNCLOS, the Fish Stocks Agreement, we've got now a binding Port State Measures Agreement, we've got the Compliance Agreement, we've got some soft law as well. Why do we need regional governance frameworks? So you've mentioned some strong elements, but isn't the international enough? Tiaru, what do you think? Why do you think we need the regional in addition to that whole suite of international governance frameworks? What's missing in the international?
The Pacific context?
Perfect. The Pacific context. So the context for each region. So those international standards, those instruments, they're really good at setting international rules, commonalities across the entire world, but in a fisheries context in particular, the regions are different. What else? So there's a Pacific context, the regional context. What else is the reason that we can have regional governance frameworks? Why do they work perhaps better in some instances than not? Any other comments, or please?
I think it's also for generally for accountability. When you answer, making sure that whatever you have in place does not negatively impact individuals, groups of people, or people who share common resources, etc.
Absolutely. So there's an excellent one about accountability. There's perhaps more accountability when you have a more focused group that have an interest in the region, that have a stake in the resources that are being managed. Please.
Thank you. I also think more in like of enhancing that collaboration as a region, coming together in a smaller group, you know, and especially within coming together as members to make decisions from that regional or international framework. Thank you.
Absolutely. So that regional collaboration, I think it was Francis this morning that talked about pooling of resources, regional collaboration to get things done. You know, if you have 196 or plus countries trying to do a specific activity, it's pretty tough. But if you have those who are directly involved, let's say fishing context, operationally involved, economically involved, then perhaps there's better leverage to get things done. So let's talk more specifically about IUU fishing. How can, with that context of, we know roughly what a regional governance framework is, and I'll go into a bit more detail. We've understood some features of why it's important in the logical flow from international governance. But how can that address IUU fishing? How can regional governance frameworks, whether RFMOs or regional fisheries bodies, how can they address IUU fishing? Any thoughts? What's one of many ways? Any hands? Oh, please.
Enforcement one. So, for example, like with the FFA member countries working together to work on enforcement.
Absolutely. So enforcement is an interesting one. So say you're a regional governance framework which would set the rules for an RFMO or for SPC or FFA to exist. Do those regional organisations have enforcement capabilities? Do they have any enforcement powers?
Which ones, sorry?
The regional organisations or within the regional governance frameworks. So you're half right. But do they have any enforcement powers? No. Where are their enforcement powers lying? National level. Under all those international instruments that we saw this morning and yesterday, what do they all rely upon? On national implementation. None of these will work. So at the international level, at the regional level, without national implementation. So many of you within your regional labour coordination meetings, it's important so you can look at best practice, you can look at the approaches, you can share, exchange ideas, but it actually means very little if you're not doing it at the national level. Similarly for fisheries, you can have rules and regulations at a regional level with SPC, FFA, or RFMOs, which some of you are members to one or more. It means very little if you don't have anything at the national level. So that's why when we're all working at the national level, it's very important to understand the context of what we're doing. It fits within a regional framework, which fits within an international framework. But it's all dependent upon what you do locally, whether it's coastal, whether it's offshore, whether it's a combination of the both. And the final question was the key examples in the Pacific. So there's regional fisheries management organisations. What's the main one for the region? Just sing out. WCPFC. Are any of you guys members to other RFMOs? Yep, we've got a few. And so we'll talk about the differences there? And what other regional governance frameworks are you party to? New Treaty. So that's another example. So we've talked about regional fisheries bodies, which is like SPC, FFA. We've talked about regional fisheries management organisations like WCPFC, or for say, the Cook Islands is also party to CIOFA and SPRIFMO. Vanuatu's party to quite a lot. And so Australia is party to 6 or 5+1. But there's also, Uni's just pointed out, there's also regional treaties that exist in the region. The Niue Treaty is actually something specifically binding international treaty between Pacific Island countries to address cooperation and enforcement to address IUU fishing. It's pretty specific. So the first global treaty that's binding to address IUU fishing is spouted as the PSMA, but in the region there's already the Niue Treaty and then some subsidiary agreements. So thanks for your time today. No, I'm not finished yet. So I'll see if we can backfill and if we missed anything about what we talked about. So we've just talked about the international frameworks. Kathleen and Francis gave us a really good combination of setting the scene. And hopefully in hearing about those provisions of UNCLOS, the Fish Stocks Agreement, some of the soft law as well, you can appreciate what some of the reasons for the rules and then what the global expectations are. Then as we move to the regional level, we've got regional fisheries bodies. Often when we're talking in the Pacific, often we'll just talk about RFMOs, but regional fisheries bodies are sort of just multilateral fisheries agreements, and so SPC and FFA are considered within the regional fisheries bodies. There's some pseudo RFMOs or CAMLA in the south, which is actually not an RFMO. The main distinction is an RFMO is a type of regional fisheries body that specifically looks at the sustainable management of species in a particular area. And then, as Uni just said, there's also treaties, agreements, and arrangements that your countries can multilaterally agree to assist with your fisheries and the management of those. So there's some of the regional frameworks. Why are they important for you at a national level? They're going to make you do stuff. They'll make you, there's certain obligations, there'll be reporting obligations. We heard from the professor on climate change. They set a great framework for data collection as well, and to provide you with the tools that you need to do your job. So you've seen there's a logical flow from the international to the regional and sub-regional, and then to the national level. The flow is often put like this from international down, but nothing can exist without national level implementation. So depending on whatever sector you're working in, all of those requirements being completed nationally is critical for any successful efforts to address IUU fishing. We've had a good discussion already about RFMOs, but looking at it specifically, it's really important to know what are the key things of RFMOs. So firstly, from a governance perspective, or in terms of what guides it, what document guides the WCPFC, your employer? What document is the constitution for the WCPFC existing? CMMs, that's one important element that has binding obligations. What sits above CMMs? Any other takers? Okay, the convention. So the convention's just like your main text. It's like UNCLOS is your, the mothership of the law of the sea. Then you've got any of these RFMOs has a constitution, has an agreement or an arrangement that will set out the rules. Jonas, you mentioned something that sets out a legal instrument. That's what the WCPFC sets up. What's important in any context of these regional organisations or RFMOs, it hits some critical areas. What's the mandate? So for RFMOs, what area is it going to cover? So important, because then you can see who has jurisdictional control over that area based on UNCLOS rules. What species are going to be addressed? Francis talked about this morning about the different species that can be managed. We also heard about a couple of gaps that exist in RFMOs. Tuna, we look at the range of the species and where it's going, and then we can see that, yeah, it's going in both high seas and EEZs in the Pacific. So that's the justification for having an RFMO that covers both, despite the challenges that presents to Pacific Island countries. So you've got a mandate, you've got a membership. We talked about, one of the comments we heard then was that it has a number of countries or parties. That's really critical, because you have particular countries that are party to these regional governance frameworks. Who can be a party? That can differ depending on the rules. So for RFMOs, generally, if you have an interest in the area, WCPFC is actually quite a unique one in terms of the interplay of who's allowed in, who's not. But arguably, if you have an interest in the resource or the area, then you should have a potential right to participate in that. And then, like Jonas had said, there's specific rules. Legal, policy, there's CMMs you mentioned. There's rules that outline what you need to do communally, what everyone needs to do, and how you interact with each other. And then finally, the efficient use of resources. The reason RFMOs exist is because UNCLOS UNCLOS set up the Fish Stocks Agreement, which said for migratory and throttling stocks, these can't be done in isolation. You need to manage them regionally because the fish aren't staying in one spot. So you need to create regional, essentially, RFMOs to help do that. So if you look at how that's been done, that's directly linked to the Fish Stocks Agreement. The WCPFC convention actually copies and pastes so much from the Fish Stocks Agreement. So you can, and then your national legislation actually copies and pastes a lot from the Fish Stocks Agreement as well. So all the stuff you guys do at a national level, the principles of your Fisheries Management Act, the application of the precautionary principle, the enforcement powers and the like, a lot of that just flows down from some of these instruments. So to be effective, this is sort of in my view, but I think hopefully it'll be shared. There's a number of things that these regional organisations or regional governance frameworks need to facilitate. So data collection and monitoring, why is that important? Why do we need to know what data is there? You guys know at the national level. If you're requiring your fishers that fish in your water to report to you, all sweet. Why do you need to collect it at a regional level? Jude, why would we need to collect all the countries' information about their fishing, for example, at a regional level when all the countries already have it at a national level? Why is that important?
Mainly for stock assessment.
Yeah, to conduct those regional exercises that require multilateral input. So a stock assessment is critical. In the context of IUU, everything we do from a compliance perspective is to support effective fisheries management. MCS enforcement means nothing on its own. It's only there to really instill and ensure that we have sustainable fisheries management. So what we see, to be effective, there's data collection and monitoring. So you can know what fishing is occurring, where is it occurring, by who, operational activity, and then rules and compliance. So for RFMOs, what's the compliance? Like, what does compliance mean in RFMOs? What's being done? Any takers on this team here? Ma'am, what do you think from a compliance perspective these regional organisations are looking at?
I think with the compliance activity, regional framework are looking at if they follow the set rules and standards that are there for them to comply and avoid IUU.
And who's they? Who's compliance they're looking at?
National level, regional level.
So if Tonga licenses a boat, the fishing vessel Viv Fernandes, I'm the master of the vessel and I fish illegally in Tonga's waters, which is part of the WCPFC area. Whose compliance? Does Viv go in front of the meeting and get told off? Tonga does, exactly. So one of the key principles that we're looking at from an international perspective, but also the regional perspective, is it's looking at state level compliance, states being the countries. And that's quite important because when you as Pacific Islanders are engaging in the compliance schemes of these different international forums, it's not about another country looking specifically at the owners of your vessel alone or the compliance of those. It's about doing what we heard yesterday, ensuring appropriate flag state responsibility. It should be the country level state compliance. Of course, if it's an unknown vessel that's conducting IUU fishing, if you have naughty operators like the Viking, then yeah, you need to go into the specifics, but that should be a collaborative effort at the state level. So essentially, through effective regional governance frameworks, we can have the tools and the collective approaches to effectively monitor what's going on from fishing. We can identify when there's good or bad things happening that we need to respond to. We can start to mobilize the resources and actions to respond to IUU fishing, because you can't do anything with a patrol boat or with an investigations team or even an email to a flag state if you don't actually have the information. It also provides a framework to assess countries' compliance, which is quite important and why a lot of you will be in the hot seat, whether you work for Foreign Affairs or whether you work for Fisheries. And then finally, an often forgotten element of regional governance frameworks is it's actually trying to support each other, to help each other, support to improve capacity, like the Catfish project. That's not a regional governance framework, unless I misunderstood the introduction. But the whole point of these institutions is not just to reprimand the bad players, it's to actually support each other to ensure we have sustainable fisheries, fish for our future, fish for our grandchildren. So Francis actually already covered this better than I did with a much prettier slide. But there's an important need to look at the nature of your country when you're dealing with the regional governance frameworks. So for example, within the Pacific Island countries, we have some countries that are coastal states, many now, well historically FFA members, which all of you are, were primarily just coastal states. I say just coastal states. UNCLOS established EEZ, said, hey, you've got the right to exclusively manage up to 200 nautical miles from your islands. Then from there, FFA came together and said, hey, we need to actually get value out of this, make sure we can get the value from our resources, but also make sure that it's effectively managed. What's happening now, the majority of the Pacific Island countries are now flag states. So you're flagging vessels. We've got a flag state operator manager right here who's governing that process for his country. So with new opportunities comes new responsibilities. So whether you're a flag state, a coastal state, a port state, we heard from Kathleen that it's pretty hard to manage flag states because they're not doing a very good job, a lot of them. So we're going to shift it to focusing on some of the bottlenecks like port states. Understand the logic, but that's also a potential impact on coastal states that have ports such as the Pacific Island countries. And then we also have market states, so where the product's going. Francisco likes saying, you know, fish needs to get on a dinner plate somehow, so it doesn't have any economic value. We heard about the drivers and the economic incentives, but you're not going to get any value unless you can actually get it to market. So these regional organizations and regional governance frameworks have rules, requirements, and mechanisms for sharing information between all these types of states, all of which play a critical role in managing fisheries. And so each of you, and I've looked over everyone's sort of role and area that you work in, all of you have a direct link into elements of the requirements under these. Whether it's labour focused, which has obvious requirements both as flag state, port state, and also just at the national level. Flag state responsibilities is critical for effectively addressing IUU fishing, and coastal state management and requirements are so important because it's your waters. We heard from Joyce yesterday that the approach in the Pacific has been for zone-based management. Again, a unique situation where you've got a RFMO where the majority of the stock and the convention area, the operational convention area, is within national waters. So we've seen this before, and I wanted to pick up on this because Joyce outlined it really well yesterday about the concept of disproportionate burden. But in the context of regional governance frameworks, the idea is great. Like international agreements, the idea is really great, but actually implementing it is really challenging because we're not dealing with a static issue, we're dealing with fish that are moving around the place, we're dealing with countries that have different capacity, different interests, and we've got this perverse issue of having historical distant water fishing countries being used to taking what they want from wherever they want. UNCLOS did a lot to address that, the fish stocks agreement's working hard. But here you see we have majority of EEZs where a lot is taken out. A lot of the tuna resources from a tuna perspective is taken out. Coastal fisheries, a lot of you work in coastal fisheries as well. That's not only food for export, that's food that you know, livelihoods. People who work, who actually leave their jobs and go out. I was in Nauru last week or a couple of weeks ago. Everybody fishes almost every day. You can sell it and maintain food for your family just through your direct fishing activity. So the points that Joyce raised yesterday and what regional governance frameworks are challenging to address is how to keep the rules in the high seas the same as the rules or compatible with the rules that are in zone. So the regional fisheries bodies like FFA, SPC, sub-regional groups like P&A set up pretty strong rules as to what you need to do to access the waters. We've heard about that harmonised minimum terms and conditions, minimum things that need to come. From a labour perspective, we've got a situation, I think there's five or six people here who work in labour industries. There's harmonised agreed rules between all FFA members for labour standards on crew. But at the moment, those don't apply to any of these high seas pockets. So there's gaps. But under the WCPFC convention, there's a requirement for there to be compatible measures between the high seas and what's in zone. So the Pacific Island countries negotiate to say, we're doing this in our zones, now you've got to do it in the high seas. In my view, it shouldn't be that way. It should have been better in the high seas from the first instance, but it's not. So the biggest challenge of the governance framework is to try to have compatible measures. Migratory species, if you don't have compatible measures and you damage a stock in one area, of course that has an impact in others. And then disproportionate burden. Can someone explain to me, I know we heard from Joyce about what it is. What does disproportionate burden of conservation efforts mean? Aussie. Disproportionate burden of conservation efforts. What does that mean just to you in your own words? When you hear that term and you engage in some of the work that you do, what does it mean when there's a disproportionate burden and how does that play out in the work that you've done?
disproportionate burden to me is when rules and procedures are set up, and those rules may burden us in some way.
And why might they burden Kiribati more than Australia,
For example, Australia may have different resources to manage, and for us, tuna is the only resource that we rely on. So if there's if they put more stringent rules on those resources, we might be affected by that.
And then looking at the skipjack stock, so skipjacks, obviously in a tropical area, between, say, let's use that example, Australia and Kiribati. If you were to say that for all, tropical tuna fisheries, you have to take all of these rules and obligations under to your country level, why is that more impactful on Kiribati than on Australia?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So you said, right, there can be certain things in place that can be difficult because you have different setups and your reliance on fish is perhaps more than others. But even looking at, well, maybe Australia is a bad example. Let's say, for example, I don't know, let's say the US, let's say the EU, okay, EU is a good one to say right now. EU against Kiribati, and say in terms of rules that will mean you're not allowed to fish for 6 months of the year because we've got to protect the stock. Why is that more impactful on Kiribati?
To me, I think, for example, on the fat exemption measures in place, for us, if we put those measures in place, we will lose out on, for example, the revenue. But it's the resource that we need to conserve for our future generations.
Absolutely. So, as Wasi mentioned there, because the fish are in the Pacific Island countries' waters, because perhaps there's been times where their development aspirations haven't been able to be realized by Pacific Island countries, and if, for instance, there's a requirement, for example, to put port state measures across all Pacific Island countries, that's going to disproportionately impact those port states here or the coastal states as opposed to the flag states as well. So that requirement to address that is actually embedded within the convention for the WCPFC. But just something to keep in mind as you talk about things at an international level and try to level the playing field and also trigger better flag state engagement. So I've got about 20 seconds left. I'm always running late. So we've seen through UNCLOS set up the fish stocks agreement. That set the framework. There's a number of instruments that Kathleen mentioned. Then on the framework of that, the FFA was created much before there was an RFMO in the region. FFA was 1979, we'll say, 45 years ago. WCPFC was 2004. So there's a difference there. But then flowing there, we have a number of regional fisheries bodies that assist and provide effective means to collaborate to address IUU fishing, but primarily to have effective and sustainable fisheries management. So to summarize, all the points you guys said at the start were perhaps my key points. It feels like you're comfortable with understanding a regional governance framework, set the rules within a region. Importantly, they're contextually appropriate. They have the right players in the room, and they should be specific and sensitive to your needs in the region, the stock, the way things are done, the importance to your economy, and also the capacity you have to respond. They usefully provide the means and rules to address IUU fishing, and primarily that's through data collection and sharing, but there's also critical regional enforcement sharing and treaties in place, such as the Niue Treaty and other collaborative arrangements that Pacific Island have. And then my final point is just to remember everything relies on national implementation. So it's easy to think that if you're working in a job that doesn't go to international meetings or doesn't go to fisheries meetings, then perhaps you're not part of it, but you're actually where it all starts. You're the reason that this exists. And without the national level efforts, there's going to be no ability to address IUU fishing.